The Q&A is still not over. Just got back from the gym. I'm going to try to address 4 questions this time instead of just 2, and I'm going to try to do it relatively rapidly. I warned you guys back when we had part 1 of the Q&A that there would be something like 999 installments in this one. We'll see how it goes when we get to 998. First question is combining several people's questions into one. I get asked about basically how I prune my social network. Some people give me compliments on this, and some people complain because they find it offensive. It's true on the one hand that I am constantly initiating new cooperative relationships with people on the internet, and that's a big part of politics, is reaching out to people and saying, hey, let's make something positive happen together. And on the other hand, people have seen me cut those relationships off, where I say, nope, this is past the point of diminishing returns, nothing positive come from it, so I'm not talking to this person anymore. I'm no longer trying to initiate cooperation or collaboration with them. And now, as soon as you get to the point of managing hundreds of online relationships, let alone thousands, you have to do that. But I think it's also just something, it's intrinsic to politics itself, and it's really part of having a business-like attitude towards the world. It's very sad to me when I see people of my own generation who think of the world in terms of allies and enemies. It's not really the case. I mean, whether it's business or politics is a question of who can I cooperate with and who can I not cooperate with. And, you know, if there's someone I can't cooperate with, that doesn't mean they're bad. It doesn't mean they're evil. It doesn't mean I hate them. It doesn't mean we have a personal conflict of any kind. It just means we can't cooperate. We can't make something positive happen together. And that's it. And that for me is the threshold of cutting them off and moving on and not wasting time. So I mean, one person wrote, I think he's offended. He referred to my having quit a Facebook group. It was, I think, Vegan Skeptics or something. He said, oh, well, you said a bunch of people in the group didn't know what they were talking about, and then you quit the group. Uh-huh. Sounds like something I do. For one thing, I mean, this was true when I was involved with Buddhism. This is true when I was involved with ecology, Green Party politics, what have you. You look around, you reach out to people in a positive way and say, oh, well, who's here? Who's in the room? Is there anyone here I can build a positive relationship with? Is there anyone here I can make something positive happen with in terms of cooperation or collaboration? And if there isn't, you leave the room. Doesn't mean you leave angry. It just means you've drawn that conclusion and you're going to move on. So, I think that's strange and startling to some people. But as I say, I have actually gotten compliments on it from some people also, people who have watched me online and have seen how that works. I guess I won't name who, but one of my fellow YouTubers said to me, in appreciation, he said he realized now, at a certain point, he said, I realize now that, you're not just constantly initiating this type of cooperation, but you've also kind of mastered when to cut people off. And he said that he needed to learn how to do that. I think because he was still managing kind of unreasonable requests, unreasonable demands on his time from all kinds of different people, and he was still laboring to make himself understood in communicating with people who were not sincerely interested in understanding him. And, that's frustrating. That's not real business. That's not real politics. That's not real anything. And it's not an effective use of the internet. It's not even an effective use of a cocktail party. You meet people face-to-face at the cocktail party. As I say, it's a lower criterion. Not talking about friends and enemies. Not even talking about friendship. But you're definitely not talking about allies and enemies or what have you. Who can I work with? Who can I collaborate with? Who can I communicate with? And who can I not? So look, I mean, again, if any of you guys want to be offended at any particular instance of that, of some Facebook group I quit or what have you, you got to think about it from my perspective. I joined a given Facebook group for a reason. Currently, I'm really in China. I'm not using Facebook at all, by the way. Facebook is not a very effective tool for meeting people, making friends or allies. But any medium, any forum, any discussion group like that, there's a limited number of people who are active in there. You go in, you see who they are. Do you have any common ground you can build on? And if not, keep it moving. I mean, the good thing is you guys can hear the tone of my voice. As I say, this is something I've contacted thousands of people in total this way. And, there's a minority within a minority you can make something positive happen with. Why do I have an interview? There's a guy named Violent Vegan. Why do I have an interview with him on my channel? Because he was willing and able to cooperate with me. A lot of other people who I might who I might want to even be friends with, but who couldn't get their act together to do that. I'd be happy to talk to him again. I'd be happy to record another Skype conversation with him and put it on my channel. Why? Because I can. Because he's somebody I can cooperate with. I mean, politically, do I even know how much we have in common? Not really. I don't know him that well. I don't know his political views that well. I don't think of him in terms of an enemy or an ally, but he's someone I can cooperate with, so I will. And that's as I say, I use this phrase all the time. That's me going around with an open heart and an open mind and trying to make the best of connections with my fellow human beings. But sure, it's also a very low criterion. If I can't cooperate with you, the threshold is pretty low. As soon as it's clear I can't have positive cooperation with you, and it's over. And there's just no point in my spending 1 minute writing you an email, because I could be writing that email to a lot of other people who would value my time and who would sincerely like to communicate with me, cooperate with me, or organize political action. So, all right. I think this is not the order I'd planned. All right, Madalena writes in. A lot of you guys already know Madalena by her first name at this point. She is asking about my studying method. So I assume she means for language primarily, not for history and politics. And she talks about her own struggles with studying at the computer and so on. Look, the truth is, the methods I used to study were very different for each of the languages that I have studied. And at this point, that list of languages is frighteningly long. And it's been different because my goals have been different, because the languages themselves have been different, and because the nature of my motivation has been different. And one of the things that I've said openly here, even now in China, is that I don't want to learn Chinese. It's both true past tense and present tense. I didn't want to learn Chinese, and I still don't. I am doing it anyway. But my motivation for Chinese is completely different from my motivation for a language like Pali. Pali is an ancient dead language, mostly associated with Buddhism, and it comes from India. I mean, in terms of geography, it's not an East Asian language; it's a South Asian language. With Laotian, probably for a full year in Laos, the first whole year, I was really ambivalent about whether or not I wanted to learn Lao at all, whether or not I should be learning Lao, whether or not studying that language was a waste of my time. And I was studying Pali and what have you. Now, why was that? I was really thinking maybe I should switch to Burmese, language of Myanmar. Maybe I should switch to Cambodian. It was the feeling that Cambodia's history and culture and politics were deep and huge, whereas Laos was sort of small and crowded and, not as many centuries to work on. And obviously the temptation of Myanmar at that time, Myanmar still had a civil war going on, and the prospects for humanitarian work connected to Myanmar were in some ways very appealing. So for a whole year, I was studying Lao, I was speaking it at the market, I was buying mangoes using that language, but I was not highly focused and committed on Lao, and I was ambivalent about whether or not that was the right language to be learning. And then, I was dragged into a police station by corrupt policemen who tried to extort money out of me. And speaking Lao as best I could, I handled that threat, and I was talking to them. I remember that day when I got home, and I won, by the way. I didn't pay a dime, and I really outsmarted them. It'd be very difficult to tell the story, but what I did was very clever. And the police themselves were delighted at it. When they figured out how I'd beaten them at their own game, they were laughing and smiling. They said, oh, wow, okay, you really pulled this off. And they invited me to kind of get involved with them in a different scam. Very peculiar story. Anyway, hey man, Laotian police officers, nicest bunch of guys who ever tried to extort money out of me. But that did end in my favor. But obviously, in terms of the language, it was a huge challenge all of a sudden. I remember I got home from that, I looked at the books on my table, and I thought, look, either I'm all the way in or all the way out. Because the type of danger I had to manage there, political danger and this kind of thing, I couldn't anymore be sort of halfway committed to studying the language. Either it was Laos now, either I committed to that country and that language, or I pack up and leave now. Like, whether it's Cambodia or Myanmar, I couldn't remain indecisive. And so from that day forward, then all my study methods changed, and my whole emphasis changed. I switched to studying Lao. So this, I mean, obviously this is not the answer you want to hear. Currently, I am in the classroom with a teacher face-to-face, speaking and studying and practicing Chinese for 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. That's a huge burden. The amount of studying I've been doing outside of class has been very little, mostly due to illness. I was very sick for quite a long time. I'm not sure right now how I'm going to switch it up. Again, I'm aware with all the languages I studied, I'm aware of my own strengths and weaknesses. In some ways, I have a natural advantage with a written language. And so then you have the question, are you going to force yourself to work against your strengths in working on spoken language, or are you going to take advantage of your strengths and plunge deeper into the written language, etc., etc.? I guess the one thing I'd say is that in the approach to studying languages, the mistake most people make is of searching for simplicity. They want to simplify the study itself and simplify the information they're studying. And simplicity is your enemy. With languages, the way the brain works is that we remember things, we access information, and we learn information through associations between things. So the more complex associations you have, the better you're able to both learn, retain, and use that information. Memorizing one fact in isolation is much less useful to you than having complex network of thoughts, ideas, and facts that connect to that. So plunging into the complexity of language and meaning rather than trying to simplify things. Like most people, the first stage is, okay, here's a complex part of the language. I'm going to simplify it and write it down and exclude most of the information so that it's easier for me to learn. That's almost the opposite of what you want to do. And even with something like, the Chinese characters, I break them down in my analysis so there's more and more information to learn, so that I learn the components that make up the character, multiple meanings, a whole history, etymological information about the word, etc., and its range of meanings. So even though you're remembering more, you're memorizing more, you're also learning a complex cluster of ideas instead of having an isolated factoid information that's harder for you to actually work with. Okay, Aushra, I may be mispronouncing your name. Aushra asked the question, what do you think about studying psychology in university? I'm really interested in it, but my parents are very skeptical about its usefulness and my future employment. Now, Aushra, I do not know what country you're living in, and, obviously I don't know your exact age. The single greatest piece of advice I can give you is to meet the people face to face who actually have the jobs in that sector, and to get them in a situation where they can really be honest with you. That's not easy. It's in some cultures it's more difficult. Like in British culture, to sit down with someone who's a psych major who's gone on to do some kind of work after being a psych major, and to get them to really talk about the way in which their job sucks, the way in which their life is difficult. In British culture, that's very difficult to do. I'd say it's easier in American culture. From one culture to another, you can compare different cultures. Under in what circumstances can you sit down and really get an honest statement from someone about their career, about their work challenges in their life? I knew several people who were psych majors in Victoria, BC. One guy was completely miserable. He worked with drug addicts, formerly homeless drug addicts, psychological counseling for them, and he, obviously it devastated his whole life long term. He would just say things like there's a 0% recovery rate. He was talking to these people, but he felt nothing he was doing helped them, and nothing positive came out of it whatsoever, the type of counseling or guidance he was giving them, that this was kind of a terrible farce. Now, not everyone feels that way. I'm sure you could talk to someone who'd done a similar job and who felt they were really making a very meaningful difference in the world. When I was taking the tests, the aptitude test to join the Army, the guy who literally sat next to me writing the tests, he was a psych major, he had a psych background, and he had been doing exactly the same work I just described for several years. There's two different guys. And so I talked with him a little bit, and obviously the reason why he was joining the Army was that he also felt that his life and talents had been totally wasted as a psych major. And again, he mostly dealt with drug addicts and what have you. Now, different strokes for different folks. For me personally, how would I have done in that line of work? Would my set of humanitarian instincts and research interests have found that rewarding? I don't know. But again, talking to people who have actually walked that path, that's the crucial step. And also, I mean, it's funny because you both have to know how to not disregard advice when you hear it, how to take seriously the hints in what they're telling you. But on the other hand, some people are going to just give you propaganda. So you need to know when to disregard information also. When people just tell you, oh, it's wonderful. When you can get honest intelligence out of people, really knowing how to carry that around in your pocket and to be aware, okay, that's his perspective based on his experience working with drug addicts. But, what about the other perspectives, the other types of research or other types of applied psychology? Who else can I talk to? But anyway, this is true of every field, even including Buddhist philosophy, by the way. I talked to tons of people in that field and got a whole range of their impressions, and most of them were miserable. I mean, just like the two psychologists, most of them were completely miserable with that field. Again, some of the advice I took very seriously. Some of it I disregarded, and I later regretted that I disregarded. And some of it I disregarded, and I was completely right to disregard it because the people giving me the advice were insane or were eccentrics or was just terrible advice. So yeah, that's my approach to all fields and all disciplines. Only problem being when you're walking into a field of discipline where there is nobody else who does what you do. When you do something really original, then things get scary. All right, Miranda writes, so this question is very salient to a lot of discussions I've had on the channel lately and here on Patreon. Miranda writes, I guess I'll quote the whole thing. Miranda starts by thanking me for my approach to the wild, talking about wild animals, not domesticated animals. And then in the middle of her comment, she says, quote, but that being said, it seems like if people start to think of farmed animals as having pet qualities, they may be more likely to stop eating meat and other byproducts, or that seems to be something that is working at least. Do you think we should continue these arguments about how caring and loving animals can be, as they seem to reach people on an emotional level? So close quote. So she's asking about this business of presenting farm animals as equivalent to pets. So arguing that a pig can be just as loving as a dog, a piglet can be just as cute as a puppy, etc., etc. So look, I think the real question here is ultimately of harm and risk. Threats of violence within veganism. There's real harm. There's real risk. It really discredits us as vegans. And as you know, I've dealt with this lately. But I talked about it in the relatively distant past. I mean, I've used other examples. When you look at the history of communism, communists spent a great deal of time using violence against themselves. Communists killing their fellow communists. Horrifying. That part of the history is it's truly horrifying. When you look at an armed movement like the IRA, the Irish independence movement, the openly violent part of the Irish independence movement, again, they spent a lot of their time killing their own people, killing and persecuting their fellow members of the IRA. And anyone who lived through that struggle and in living memory in recent decades, a lot of them, when they talk about it, their main fear in life, the fear they had to go to sleep with every night, was not so much the fear of their enemy. It was their fear of being killed or persecuted by their friends, by other people in the same movement of themselves. So there are a lot of other examples of that. So the tendency towards violence within veganism, which you can see even on YouTube, and you can see it on the people who threaten to beat me up, threaten to kill me, threaten to have me arrested. You can see it in my own life, but you can also see it in my critique of Gary Yourofsky, my critique of other violent and pseudo-violent movements in veganism. There's danger, there's risk, there's an issue of being discredited, there's real harm to the vegan movement as a whole. Now this, by contrast, it's safe to play with. I don't think it harms veganism in that way, even if it's kind of wrong or kind of dumb. And it's also not, it's kind of a fiction that's not incompatible with the truth. You can do both, right? You can talk about how cute a piglet is. And at the same time, you could say in the very next sentence, you can talk about how wild boars live in the wild. What the qualities of ferocity, independence, defiance, dignity that this has as a wild animal. You can do both. Something can be cute and at the same time have the dignity of being a real wild animal. I think it's really worth talking about that wild boars eat meat and they eat large mammals, and wild boars do try to kill human beings. That, in nature, they're not our friends, they're our enemies. They literally prey on us when they have a chance in the woods. And again, I've actually had email from people writing into me saying, yeah, they know what that's like. They know what it's like to be stalked by or attacked by a wild boar in the woods. But still, they can be cute. I mean, a baby lion can be cute, and we can also recognize, look, in the wild, lions are not our friends. So in that sense, even though, I've come down in a logical way, I've got a sort of very strong position on this. This is a situation where you can, to some extent, play with this. You can mix fiction and fact to some extent, and there's not going to be real harm or risk that comes out of it. However, having said this, and I know I've said similar things recently, we need to be very clear with ourselves and others when there is harm, when there is risk, when we're discrediting ourselves, and when we're ultimately putting ourselves in peril as vegans, and we're putting veganism as a social movement in peril. And very clearly, violence and defamation and pseudoscience. Give 3 examples. Pseudoscience, like claim that eating garlic contains a neurotoxin. Violence, defamation, pseudoscience. There's real risk. There's real harm. These are things that really discredits us, and these are things where we cannot have any compromise. We cannot have any mix of fact and fiction. But look, if you want to say that a piglet can be cute and loving just like a puppy, okay, you can do that also. But obviously, given the context of 2016, I've had to come down on YouTube and say very clearly the other side of the story that's been forgotten. And how dogs behave in the wild is something human beings want to forget. How pigs, wild boars behave in the wild is something we want to forget. And ultimately, the cutesy poo discourse, yeah, it could open some doors. It could make some people listen to reason who otherwise wouldn't have listened to reason. However, it is not rational itself. Once the doors open, once they're listening to reason, then you have to be prepared to provide something truly rational, truly reasonable, truly convincing. And that's not going to be cuteness alone. That's not going to win the struggle for a vegan future. Thanks for listening to me, guys. This is not the first part and not the last part of the Q&A. I don't know how many more I'm going to do. But I hope you guys appreciate it. I appreciate your questions. I appreciate every person on Patreon. I appreciate every dollar I'm getting. And I hope we are really building a crossroads, a network of like-minded people that can accomplish something really positive in the future.